The flickering fluorescent light cast long, unforgiving shadows across the scarred wooden surface of the kitchen table. Piles of paper thick and heavy with the weight of impending ruin covered every inch of the space. Red letters screamed words like final notice and immediate action required. An old pair of hands, deeply lined and trembling slightly, reached out to trace the edge of a hospital bill that represented more money than a lifetime of sweeping floors could ever earn. The silence of the small, suffocating apartment was broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a medical ventilator in the next room keeping a young boy alive. The deafening roar of 60,000 fans still seemed to vibrate in the concrete bones of the Alamodome, a phantom echo of the night before. Strobe lights had cut through the thick haze of smoke and sweat, but now, in the dead of the Texas night, all that remained was the hollow, lonely scrape of stiff bristles against cold cement. The stands were a wasteland of crushed beer cups, scattered popcorn, and sticky puddles of spilled soda. In the center of this cavernous emptiness stood an elderly woman, her shoulders bowed under the weight of an invisible burden. She wore a faded janitorial uniform that swallowed her fragile frame, hanging 2 sizes too large. She swept the endless rows of stairs in absolute stoic silence. Her calloused hands gripped the wooden handle of the broom as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. As she leaned forward to gather the debris, a worn silver chain slipped from beneath her collar. Dangling at the end of it was a tarnished silver pendant shaped like a guitar pick. In the deep shadows of the tunnel leading to the main stage, a tall figure stood motionless. The brim of a black resistal hat obscured his eyes, but his presence commanded the empty space. George Strait watched the solitary figure working in the dim light. The contrast was a heavy, melancholic truth, the invisible backbreaking labor of the forgotten, standing in the very spot where kings of music were crowned. Clara Miller was 72 years old, an age where most folks in Texas were sitting on wrap around porches watching their grandchildren chase fireflies in the warm evening breeze. But Clara had no porch, and her only grandson Tommy could not chase anything. A tragic car accident on a rain-slicked highway 5 years ago had taken her son and daughter-in-law, leaving Tommy paralyzed from the waist down and dependent on a mountain of specialized medical care. Clara had traded her golden years for a mop and a bucket, spending the last decade scrubbing the floors of the Alamodome. She was a ghost in the machine, an invisible force that made the pristine suite sparkle before the wealthy patrons arrived. She endured the aching joints, the blistered heels, and the bone-deep exhaustion with a quiet dignity fueled solely by the need to keep Tommy's basic health insurance active. The arena was sweltering the brutal San Antonio heat radiating off the asphalt outside and seeping through the walls. The industrial air conditioning groaned and rattled, fighting a losing battle against the humidity. The air inside smelled of harsh chemical floor wax, stale roasted peanuts, and the faint lingering scent of old leather. It was 3 days before the most anticipated event of the year, a monumental Mother's Day concert by the King of Country himself. The atmosphere was tight, stretched thin by the relentless demands of a new operations manager named Chad. Chad was a transplant from a corporate high-rise in New York, a man who wore custom-tailored suits that looked entirely out of place in the heart of Texas. He viewed the world through spreadsheets and profit margins. To him, the maintenance staff were not human beings with families and struggles. They were merely numbers, liabilities that needed to be optimized or discarded. He despised the slow, deliberate pace of the older workers, viewing their age as an insult to his modern, high-efficiency vision for the venue. The tension snapped during the afternoon sound check. The arena was mostly empty, save for the crew running cables and adjusting the massive speaker rigs. Up on the main stage, George Strait stood with his acoustic guitar, his fingers lightly dancing across the strings, testing the acoustics of the massive dome. The sound was pure, rich, and steeped in decades of storytelling. But the harmony was violently interrupted by a sharp nasal voice echoing from the lower boxes. Chad was standing over Clara, his face flushed with irritation. He was pointing an accusatory finger at a dark, sticky stain of dried soda on the polished concrete. Clara had been scrubbing it for 10 minutes, her old knees resting on a thin, worn foam pad. Chad did not care about her effort. He raised his voice, ensuring that the surrounding crew members could hear his reprimand. He called her obsolete. He told her she was a relic moving too slowly for the elite standards he was implementing. He warned her with a cruel sneer that if she did not double her pace, she would be stripped of her shifts for the main event, effectively threatening the paycheck she desperately needed for Tommy's next round of physical therapy. Clara did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply lowered her eyes to the floor, her weathered face flushing with a deep, quiet humiliation. She murmured a soft, respectful acknowledgement and pressed her raw hands harder against the scrubbing brush. Up on the stage, the music stopped. George Strait is a man of few words, known for his stoic demeanor and a profound, deeply rooted Christian aversion to cruelty. He did not shout into the microphone. He did not make a scene. He simply unstrapped his guitar, handed it to a technician, and walked down the stage steps. The sound of his leather boots hitting the concrete floor echoed like a steady heartbeat in the sudden silence of the arena. Every step was deliberate, carrying the weight of a man who knew the value of hard work and despised the arrogance of the privileged. Chad, hearing the approaching footsteps, turned and instantly plastered a sycophantic smile on his face, ready to greet the star. But George did not even look at him. He walked straight past the manager, knelt down, and placed his large, steady hands over Clara's trembling ones. He gently took the scrub brush from her grip and helped her lift the heavy bucket of murky water. Chad stammered, trying to justify his outburst, claiming he was only ensuring the venue was perfect for the show. George remained silent, his jaw set in a tight, unyielding line. As he helped Clara to her feet, his eyes caught the glint of silver. The sudden movement had caused Clara's necklace to swing free from her uniform. George's gaze locked onto the tarnished guitar pick. Even in the dim light, he could clearly see the year engraved deeply into the metal. 1979. Clara, mortified by the attention and deeply ashamed of her reprimand, quickly tucked the necklace back under her shirt, grabbed her bucket, and hurried away toward the service tunnels, her limp more pronounced in her haste. George stood completely paralyzed, the heavy bucket forgotten at his side. He knew that piece of silver. He knew the exact weight of it, the exact way the numbers were etched into the surface. It was a ghost from a past he held sacred. The days that followed were a suffocating nightmare for Clara. Chad, sensing the silent judgment in George's eyes and feeling his authority subtly undermined by the country star's intervention, decided to make an example of the old woman. He could not fire her without cause just yet, but he could make her quit. He reassigned Clara from the climate-controlled suites to the most grueling sector of the entire property, the concrete access ramps of the outdoor parking garage. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly, turning the ramps into an oven. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the blinding glare of sunlight reflecting off windshields. Clara accepted the punishment without a single word of complaint. She pushed her heavy cart up the steep inclines, her chest heaving, sweat stinging her eyes. She thought of Tommy, sitting in his wheelchair by the small window of their apartment, waiting for her to come home. She thought of the medical bills stacked on the kitchen table. She swallowed her pride, drank warm water from a plastic bottle, and kept sweeping the endless expanse of baking concrete. Inside the cool, shadowed confines of the backstage dressing rooms, a different kind of storm was brewing. George sat in a leather armchair, a cup of black coffee growing cold on the table beside him. He was restless, his mind flashing back to a dusty, smoke-filled bar in San Marcos decades ago. He called his longtime manager, Irv, into the room. His voice was low, carrying a quiet urgency. He asked Irv to pull the employment records from the arena management office. He needed the full name of the elderly woman who cleaned the lower boxes. Irv, knowing better than to question the singer when he had that look in his eye, nodded and left to navigate the bureaucratic maze of the venue front office. Sunday morning arrived, bringing with it the golden heavy light of Mother's Day. The air was thick with anticipation. Vendors were setting up their stalls, the smell of barbecue and sweet tea drifting through the parking lots. In a few hours, the gates would open to a sea of cowboy hats and boots. Clara arrived at the employee locker room 2 hours early, her body aching, her hands wrapped in cheap athletic tape to cover the blisters from the parking ramps. She was exhausted to her very bones, but she needed to clock in. As she reached for her faded name badge, the heavy metal door of the locker room swung open. Chad stepped in, flanked by 2 burly security guards. He looked at Clara with a cold, detached satisfaction. He informed her that the arena was moving in a different direction for the hospitality sector today. They needed a younger, more dynamic image for the high-profile guests. He told her she was too slow, too fragile, and a liability to the venue reputation. With a flick of his wrist, he ordered her to empty her locker and leave her badge on the bench. She was terminated effective immediately. Clara stood frozen, the words washing over her like ice water. 10 years of her life. 10 years of scrubbing away the filth of strangers. 10 years of invisible, backbreaking loyalty erased in a matter of seconds by a man who had never held a mop in his life. She did not cry in front of him. She possessed the quiet, unbreakable pride of a Texas woman who had weathered storms far worse than this arrogant manager. She slowly opened her locker, took out a worn photograph of Tommy, her thermos, and a spare pair of orthopedic socks. She placed them carefully into a plastic grocery bag. She unclipped the plastic name badge from her collar and set it gently on the cold metal bench. As she walked past Chad and the guards, she kept her head held high, though her heart was shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She stepped out into the blinding midday sun, the heat instantly wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. The weight of the world pressed down on her fragile shoulders. How would she tell Tommy? How would she pay for the ventilator maintenance? The despair was a physical pain in her chest as she began the long, slow walk toward the bus stop at the edge of the sprawling parking lot. If you want to see how the King of Country turns this heartbreaking injustice into a legendary moment of redemption, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and keep listening, because justice in Texas always arrives on time. Sim, pode continuar com a parte 3. Finalize a história com o clímax no show e o desfecho no rancho, mantendo a carga emocional altíssima e o estilo detalhado. Lembre-se de seguir todas as regras de formatação. Não use a palavra fim ou moral da história no encerramento. The San Antonio sun was a physical weight pressing down on the sprawling asphalt of the Alamodome parking lot like a blacksmith's anvil. The heat rose from the black pavement in shimmering waves, distorting the distant skyline and turning the air into a thick, suffocating soup. Clara Miller dragged her feet every step, sending sharp, splintering spikes of pain up her shins and into her lower back. She carried her meager belongings in the thin plastic grocery bag, the handles stretching and digging into her calloused fingers. The bus stop was still 3 blocks away, a rusted metal bench sitting entirely exposed to the merciless midday glare. She kept her eyes focused on the cracked sidewalk, counting her steps, trying to keep her mind away from the terrifying abyss of her reality. She had no job. She had no insurance. She had a paralyzed grandson sitting in a sweltering apartment waiting for her to come home, with a smile she no longer had the strength to fake. A single tear escaped her eye, cutting a clean trail through the dust that coated her weathered cheeks, but she quickly wiped it away with the back of her trembling hand. She was a Texas woman, and she would not let the world see her break. Back inside the freezing, sterile confines of the VIP dressing room, the air was thick with a completely different kind of tension. Irv, the veteran manager, had just walked through the heavy wooden door, holding a thin manila folder. He handed it to George Strait without a word. George sat in the leather armchair, the faint sounds of the opening act's soundcheck vibrating through the concrete walls. He opened the folder. The name printed in stark black ink on the cheap paper hit him with the force of a runaway freight train. Clara Miller. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, rigid mask of absolute shock. The sterile walls of the dressing room seemed to dissolve, melting away into the hazy, smoke-filled memory of a dilapidated honky-tonk in San Marcos, Texas, more than 40 years ago. He could smell the stale beer and the sawdust on the floor. He could hear the off-key ringing of the old jukebox. He saw Big John Miller standing behind the scarred wooden bar, wiping down the counter with a rag, while his wife, a much younger, vibrant Clara, carried heavy trays of long-neck bottles to a rowdy crowd of local ranchers. George remembered the paralyzing fear of being a young, unknown singer with a pocket full of dreams and absolutely no money to his name. He remembered the night he sat in the empty bar after closing time, his head in his hands, ready to give up and go back to ranching. It was Big John and Clara who had sat down beside him. They had placed a thick white envelope on the table, filled with crumpled dollar bills and faded checks. It was the money they had secretly raised by taking out a second mortgage on their struggling bar. They had risked their entire livelihood to buy a young cowboy a bus ticket to Nashville and a few hours in a recording studio. George had tried to refuse, but Clara had pressed the envelope into his hands, her eyes fierce and full of belief. He had given John a silver guitar pick that night, a humble token of a debt he swore he would one day repay. Big John had passed away years later, his business ruined by mounting medical debts, and Clara had simply vanished into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Texas landscape, too proud to ever reach out to the superstar she had helped create. George closed the folder. The silence in the room was deafening. The stoic calm that defined the king of country music was completely gone, replaced by a quiet, terrifying storm. He stood up his chair, scraping harshly against the floor. He looked at Irv, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that commanded absolute obedience. He asked where she was. Irv, checking his phone, swallowed hard and replied that management had just terminated her and escorted her off the property. She was walking toward the transit lines. George did not say another word. He bypassed his security detail, pushing through the heavy fire doors with a singular, unstoppable purpose. The backstage crew parted like the Red Sea as the tall figure in the black resistol hat strode down the corridors, his boots hammering against the concrete with the fury of a man coming to collect a debt of honor. Clara had just reached the bus stop, sinking onto the blistering metal bench, when she heard the deep roar of a heavy engine. A massive black armored SUV pulled up to the curb, kicking up a cloud of dry Texas dust. The tinted passenger window rolled down, but before Clara could even process what was happening, the heavy door swung open. George Strait stepped out into the blinding heat. He did not look like a global icon in that moment. He looked like a man who had just found something infinitely precious that he thought was lost forever. He took off his hat, holding it against his chest as he walked slowly toward the rusted bench. Clara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She instinctively tried to hide the plastic grocery bag behind her legs, deeply ashamed of her current state. George stopped a few feet away. The roar of the distant highway seemed to fade into absolute silence. He looked at the deep lines on her face, the exhaustion in her eyes, and the cheap athletic tape wrapped around her blistered hands. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion that threatened to break his legendary composure. He called her Mrs. Miller. Clara gasped. The sound of her married name, spoken with such profound reverence, shattered the walls she had built around her heart. She looked up into his eyes and saw the young, terrified boy from the San Marcos bar looking back at her. The tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilled over tracing hot paths down her face. She tried to stand up to apologize for her appearance, but her knees buckled. George was there in an instant, his strong hands catching her elbows, supporting her weight with infinite gentleness. He told her she was never going to wait for a bus in the blazing sun ever again. He guided her toward the SUV, opening the door and helping her into the cool leather interior. He ordered his driver to turn the vehicle around. They were going back to the Alamodome. The executive boardroom of the arena was a sanctuary of polished mahogany glass walls and arrogant privilege. Chad, the operations manager, was sitting at the head of the long table sipping sparkling water and reviewing digital spreadsheets on his tablet, completely oblivious to the hurricane that was about to make landfall. The door did not just open, it was shoved wide open, hitting the wall with a loud crack. George Strait walked in his presence, instantly sucking all the oxygen out of the room. Behind him stood the two billionaire owners of the arena who had been hastily summoned from their private suites. And beside George, looking small but suddenly very protected, stood Clara Miller, still holding her plastic bag. Chad stood up immediately, his face stretching into a nervous, ingratiating smile. He started to greet the singer, but George raised a single hand, cutting him off with a silence so cold it made the room temperature drop. George did not yell, he did not curse. He spoke with the quiet, lethal precision of a man who knew exactly how to dismantle a coward. He looked Chad dead in the eye and asked him to explain the concept of optimization. Chad stammered his face, turning a sickly shade of pale, trying to use corporate buzzwords about efficiency and brand image. George let him hang himself with his own words before stepping forward, his tall frame towering over the young executive. George explained in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder that the foundation of the state of Texas was not built on spreadsheets or corporate branding. It was built on the blistered hands and the unbroken spirits of people who worked in the shadows, people who scrubbed the floors so men in expensive suits could pretend they were important. He reached out and gently pulled the silver guitar pick from beneath Clara's collar, letting it rest on the polished mahogany table. He told the room exactly what that piece of silver meant. He told them about the bar in San Marcos, the second mortgage, and the supreme sacrifice of a woman who had spent the last 10 years cleaning up their garbage to keep her paralyzed grandson alive. The arena owners turned ghostly white, staring at Chad with absolute horror. George delivered his final verdict. He stated calmly that he would not step onto the stage tonight, tomorrow, or ever again in this city unless the man who humiliated Clara Miller was removed from the building immediately. Furthermore, he demanded that Clara be compensated for every single drop of sweat she had shed in this building, with a full pension and premium medical benefits for her family. Chad tried to speak, to apologize, to beg for his career, but the arena owners were already calling security. The corporate slicker was escorted out of the boardroom, his box of belongings packed just as ruthlessly as he had forced Clara to pack hers. That evening, the Alamodome was a living, breathing entity. 60,000 fans packed the stands, the air vibrating with the raw electric energy of Mother's Day. The smell of cold beer leather boots and sweet perfume filled the massive dome. The lights went down and the roar of the crowd was deafening, shaking the concrete pillars to their very foundations. George Strait stood on the stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlights, delivering a performance that felt different, deeper, and more resonant than anything he had done in years. But the true climax of the night was not a song. Halfway through the set, right before his biggest hit, George signaled the band to stop. The sudden silence was startling. The massive screens flanking the stage faded to black. A single blinding white spotlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the arena floor until it illuminated the very center of the VIP front row. There, sitting in a plush velvet chair, was Clara Miller. She was no longer wearing the oversized, faded janitorial uniform. She was dressed in a beautiful, elegant, deep blue dress, her silver hair neatly styled. Sitting right beside her in a brand new state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair was her grandson, Tommy, his eyes wide with absolute wonder as he looked up at the massive stage. George walked to the edge of the stage holding his acoustic guitar. He looked out at the sea of faces and began to speak, his voice echoing through the massive stadium. He told them a story. He painted a picture of a dusty honky-tonk in 1979. He spoke of a young boy with no money and no hope, and a hard-working couple who risked everything they had to give that boy a chance. He told the crowd about the silver guitar pick and the cruel twists of fate that had brought that proud woman to her knees, forcing her to scrub the very floors they were standing on just to survive. The stadium was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Grown men in cowboy hats wiped tears from their eyes. George looked directly at Clara, his voice thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. He told the 60,000 people in attendance that for a decade they had walked past a giant without ever seeing her. He announced that her days of sweeping floors were over forever. He raised his hand pointing toward the front row, his voice booming through the speakers with absolute majestic authority. He declared that on this Mother's Day, he wanted the entire world to know the true identity of the woman in the blue dress. She was not just a janitor. She was the mother of his music. The stadium erupted. It was not just applause, it was a seismic wave of pure, overwhelming love and respect. 60,000 people rose to their feet, roaring their approval, the sound echoing into the Texas night. Clara covered her face with her hands, weeping openly as Tommy reached out and held her arm, beaming with pride. George tipped his black hat to her, a deep, respectful bow, from a king to the woman who had built his throne. The aftermath of that night changed the landscape of the city. The arena management, deeply humbled by the public revelation, completely overhauled their treatment of the maintenance staff, instituting a permanent support fund named in Clara's honor to assist workers facing medical emergencies. Chad was blacklisted from the venue management industry, his reputation permanently destroyed by his own arrogance. But the most profound change happened far away from the concrete and the neon lights of the city. 6 months later, the Texas Hill Country was painted in the rich, golden hues of autumn. The air smelled of dry oak leaves, sweet grass, and the approaching afternoon rain. Clara Miller sat on the wide wrap-around porch of a beautiful, sprawling, single-story ranch house. The wooden floorboards were pristine, not because she had scrubbed them, but because they were brand new. She held a glass of sweet iced tea, the condensation dripping onto her lap. She was watching the front lawn where Tommy was laughing loudly, supported by state-of-the-art leg braces and 2 of the top pediatric physical therapists in the country. Every medical bill, every piece of equipment, and the deed to the ranch itself had been quietly and permanently paid for by a private trust fund established the morning after the concert. The sound of tires crunching on the long gravel driveway caught her attention. A familiar black truck pulled up near the wooden fence. George Strait stepped out wearing his worn boots and a faded denim jacket. He walked up the dirt path, the wind catching the brim of his hat. He did not come with an entourage or cameras. He came carrying a homemade pecan pie, just a neighbor dropping by for afternoon coffee. Clara stood up, leaning against the porch railing, a warm, peaceful smile illuminating her face. The heavy burdens of the past decade had been completely washed away, leaving only the quiet dignity of a life well lived. George reached the bottom of the wooden steps, looked up at the woman who had saved his life all those years ago, and tipped his hat. In the heart of Texas, where the sky stretches on forever, a man is only as good as his word, and a debt of honor forged in the dust of a small-town bar is a bond that not even time tragedy or the blinding lights of fame can ever break.